YouTube, Sidekick here with another episode of Moving Mud, the History of Iron Bombing podcast. This is episode 26. So, what have we learned? Actually, maybe the title of the episode could have been, Have We Learned Anything? But that would have been unkind and frankly unfair, despite what you may infer from many of the histories of the air war in Vietnam. But more on that maybe later. What I do want to do today is wrap up the story of Rolling Thunder for both the United States Air Force and the United States Navy, and focus on how their tactics, techniques, and procedures evolved between 1966 and 1968. And then after that, we're going to take a pause and look at what both services thought of Rolling Thunder and of the adaptations they made during the actual period of operations. In the next episode, we'll see how that experience translated into preparations for the next phase of the air war in North and for modern air combat in general. Now, by the way, after those two episodes, we are going to go back and move back in time and go back to the south of Vietnam to talk about the air war in the south, which had a totally different flavor than the air war in the north. But to return to the topic at hand, when we left both the Air Force and the Navy, it was the start of 1966, and Rolling Thunder had been rolling for 9 months, which was long enough for both of the services to confront the fact that it wasn't going as planned. Like, not at all. Now, we've talked about the whys and wherefores of that departure from plan at reasonable length, so I won't go back over that ground, but let's just say that after 9 months, it was becoming clearer, at least to those at the pointy end of the stick, that they were in a conflict for which previous doctrine and training had not prepared them. And the issues that were being encountered could basically be divided into two basic categories, I think. The first was that they were not prepared to face the threat that they faced, and second, they were not able to achieve the promised effects on North Vietnam or on targets in general. So let's look at those one at a time. Let's take a look at the threat. What exactly about the preparation in the decades, say from 1955 to 65, had meant that neither the Air Force nor the Navy was really well prepared for the threat that North Vietnam actually ended up presenting them. I think the first issue was that they really did quite significantly overestimate the capabilities of their own aircraft. This was particularly true when it came to the ability to defeat a low-level anti-aircraft artillery. It was basically common wisdom at the start of Rolling Thunder that high-speed, low-level ingress would make the effectiveness of AAA essentially incidental. That by surprising gunners and by moving quickly through their field of view, they just would not be able to respond fast enough to be able to train their weapons to be able to use AAA effectively against high-speed, low-level jet fighters. Well, that ignored a few things that had changed since 1952, the last time that the U.S. had been shot at by those similar kinds of weapons. The first of which was, it turned out that jet aircraft were an awful lot more vulnerable than their piston engine, particularly their radial piston-engined counterparts. The golden BB effect was fully in view in the first few months of Operation Rolling Thunder, meaning that anybody with any kind of caliber of weapon could get a lucky shot in that could actually completely disable a jet aircraft, no matter how fast it was traveling. The other thing is that they overestimated the effect of speed on AAA effectiveness because they didn't allow for the fact that there would be central control, which was controlled by radar, so AAA gunners would typically know when they were coming, and secondly, that there was actually a degree of radar guidance to a lot of AAA, so that in fact it wasn't the gunners that were training the guns, it was the radar, and the radar could keep up with even fast-moving targets. So, the Air Force and the Navy really were not prepared to meet the threat of AAA. And in fact, throughout Rolling Thunder and even throughout the next phase of air combat, anti-aircraft artillery still accounted for more than 2/3 of the casualties. So this was a serious issue that they had not really understood how effective AAA would be against modern jet aircraft. Neither service either was prepared to deal with surface-to-air missiles. War in the electronic spectrum was all new to basically everybody in the conflict. I mean, the only expertise in the United States in electronic warfare was in the Strategic Air Command, and they had quite a bit of it. But they had a very different mission in mind in the way that they were going to defeat surface-to-air missiles with electronic warfare, because they were going to fly very, very large strategic bombers at very, very high altitude. And the electronic warfare equipment was going to be run, managed, and fought by people who did nothing else with their time. So in tactical combat in North Vietnam, essentially everybody else was making it up as they went along in terms of figuring out how to deal with SAMs, because, of course, the fight with SAMs very much was a fight in the spectrum. Although it might be concluded, the terminal effects might be provided in real space, the actual combat was taking place in the electronic spectrum. I think that the United States also came into Vietnam overestimating their ability to achieve air supremacy. Air supremacy had basically become a de facto part of the U.S. strategy ever since the end of the Second World War, and in fact, that really hasn't changed. But I really think that both the Navy and the Air Force overestimated their ability to achieve that. After all, their air-to-air combat skills had atrophied significantly because, again, they had been focused on doing air-to-air combat with large bombers at high altitude using high-speed interceptors. Practicing the art of the dogfight, of air combat maneuvering, had basically completely disappeared from the United States pilot training spectrum, and the weapons that they had available for conducting air-to-air warfare were designed for attacking very large, slow-moving targets, and it turned out that those same weapons were not at all good at necessarily attacking low-level aircraft that were highly maneuverable and which were operating in a very crowded airspace where it wasn't at all clear who was friend and who was foe simply from a radar trace. In addition to overestimating their own capabilities, I think that the United States really significantly underestimated their enemy. In the first case, they really were not prepared for what today we would call an integrated air defense system. They still were thinking that they were going to be dealing with very isolated pockets of resistance. They really underestimated the value of countrywide search radar and of central control, including GCI of fighters, but also central control of all of the AAA and all of the SAM sites as well. Not just when to fire, but where they would be and what their rules of engagement would be. I think the United States also vastly underestimated the value of human intelligence that fed the intelligence gathering system of the Vietnam IADS. It's basically true that no one in North Vietnam was surprised at all by pretty much anything the United States did once Rolling Thunder started, with some very specific examples. But the United States failed to surprise pretty much anybody on the ground right from the get-go. And because of this, because of the amount of warning and the amount of central control that the North Vietnamese enjoyed, they were able to make AAA much more effective because they started using barrage tactics. So instead of actually aiming at fast-moving aircraft, knowing where those aircraft were going, they simply put an almost impenetrable wall of explosives and hot metal between the aircraft and their targets. And they also made sure that the surface-to-air missiles were more of a threat, or more supposed to be more of a threat than they actually ended up being. After all, SAM still only accounted for less than a third of casualties, but they certainly dominated the U.S. thinking. And essentially, they had a very effective psychological impact on aircrew because they were basically an unknown, and no pilot that flew in Vietnam at the beginning, certainly the first few months of Rolling Thunder, had any idea what to do about this new weapon. And they really had no weapons with which to identify it, defend against it, or even attack it. So, the Vietnamese People's Air Force, meaning the actual fighters of the VPAF, came to the fight pretty late in 1965. They were still training when Rolling Thunder started, but they were actually starting to prove to be pretty hard to ignore by then as well, despite the fact that they were using older model aircraft and that their pilots were significantly less well trained than the United States. They did have good tactics that were adapted to their specific situation, and they were well controlled by a central authority that was using a very good plan. And so they were effective, and that was because they weren't trying to win a lot of dogfights. They did not want to go mano a mano with American pilots. They were just looking to prevent the Americans from having freedom of operations. And, in fact, their tactics proved very effective at doing that, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So, essentially what I'm saying is that the United States, especially the United States pilots at the front end of the operation, were finding it was a lot more dangerous to fly over North Vietnam than they had expected it would be in February and March of 1965. And they were, by late 1965, early 1966, they were no longer underestimating that threat by any means. In addition to having underestimated the threat, the United States, I think, had overestimated how easy it was going to be to achieve the effects which were required. And remember, Rolling Thunder had 5 very specific aims, and they were all basically political aims about convincing the North Vietnamese not to intervene in the South. And Rolling Thunder did not achieve these aims, and it didn't even really come close because the whole premise was faulty from the start. Now, as a result of the gulf between civilian and military leadership, and between military leadership and the airmen and aviators on the ground, as that gap widened, the civilian leadership continued to want a strictly limited campaign that would be painful enough to convince the North Vietnamese to quit. The political level still lived in fear of Chinese or Soviet involvement. They did not want to win a war with the North Vietnamese. They didn't even want to appear to be winning a war. They simply wanted to convince the North Vietnamese that it was too costly to continue fighting one. Well, military leaders were embarrassed by their inability to deliver those results because, frankly, they had promised that they could do it. The bomber mafia ethos was still alive and well in the United States Air Force, particularly in 1965. It was supposed that air power could grind an enemy down to the point where they would no longer want to resist. So, when that turned out not to be true, those same military leaders began complaining that it was the imposed constraints that were preventing them from achieving their promised effectiveness, even though they had been well aware that those constraints would be in place when they made those promises. And they also began blaming frontline units, I think, for not achieving the promised results, and they exerted more remote control on the operations, including, at least for the Air Force, literally writing the equivalent of what we'd call an air tasking order every day, telling almost every pilot exactly where they would be at any given time on a daily basis. Not just by specifying targets, but by assigning literally aircraft to various roles, taking effective control away from the wing commanders and squadron commanders on the ground. They also started the process of assigning wing and squadron commanders who were, frankly, unsuited to combat leadership positions, but who needed to rotate through them in order to gain a promotion. This is an effect which is fairly well documented in some of the personal histories of Vietnam. Less true in the Navy, as we've talked about, but in the Air Force, it was definitely a problem. The leadership on the ground, except for some very, very notable exceptions, the leadership on the ground was not particularly strong, and half of their job was being done from Washington. So, for the pilots at the front who were charged with actually continuing to try and carry out this operation, all of the above made those pilots distrust the war aims entirely. And effectively, I think the threat became their focus, since they really didn't know what they were supposed to be doing and didn't seem to be doing it very well. They were really mostly interested in making sure that they survived it. So tactics and adaptation, I think, put survivability first, bombing effectiveness second, and achieving Rolling Thunder's aim, well, That wasn't even on the list at all. I'm pretty sure no frontline pilot at the time, could have told you what the 5 specific aims of Rolling Thunder were. The pilot's aims was to survive another trip, and also to hit back at an enemy that was hurting them, by defeating or suppressing their air defenses, by shooting down enemy aircraft, and by dropping bombs on something that blew up and caught fire, frankly. Now, that's not actually entirely fair. I think there was some acknowledgement that ordnance was just not as effective as had been assumed, and this is particularly true when it comes to hard point targets like bridges, where the bomb damage assessments were pretty obvious and frankly much less than the strike pilots claimed when they returned, and this was a cause of concern for frontline pilots. They wanted to be effective, but they didn't want to make themselves they didn't want to make missions less survivable in order to do it. So I think this was actually an issue that did concern frontline units, and I think the tactics over the course of Rolling Thunder did adapt to try and address the issue, and certainly the conclusions that came out of Rolling Thunder, to some extent, a lot of those were driven by frontline pilots' unease with exactly how effective they were when they had to apply tactics that made survivability a priority. So where did all that leave us in 1966? Just let's finish off the narrative. Well, first of all, both the United States Air Force and the United States Navy had assimilated the fact that they needed to apply more resources to this problem, like a lot more. The Air Force went from effectively 1.5 tactical fighter wings in Thailand to 4 tactical fighter wings, as well as a host of other support aircraft. In all, I would say that their effort probably tripled. It may even be higher than that. It might have been a factor of 5 when you actually take a look at the number of personnel hours that were going into actually waging the war on Vietnam. I'd have to check the timings to be sure, but I think the buildup was either complete or on its way to being complete by, January of 1966. Similarly, the Navy went from 4 carriers deployed to the Westpac region, meaning the Vietnam theater, which they had actually originally considered to be a surge, but they were that number had been bumped up to 8 carriers by the fall of 1965, with a significant increase in the deployment of the larger, more modern carriers that carried more aircraft. As I discussed in the last episode, this feels like about a tripling of combat power in those first 9 months, I think. Both services had been through the cycle of trying their low-level, high-speed ingress tactics, to finding that those made pilots extremely vulnerable, so they had moved to mid-level ingress, and then they'd encountered the SAM threat, and now their ingress was becoming higher altitude all the time. Now, both services had developed tactics over those first 9 months for dealing with the SAM threat, or beginning to deal with the SAM threat. The Air Force went for organic jamming. So every squadron had aircraft that carried a jammer on every mission, and they flew particular what they used to call the jamming pod formation, so that single aircraft with a jammer could protect all of the aircraft in the flight. And then the Air Force went with separate suppression of enemy air defense units to protect the whole mission package that was over North Vietnam on any given day, and these, of course, were the Wild Weasels. Now, the United States Navy went for organic suppression of air defense, so every squadron had the capability of mounting SEAD missions on any given day, and the electronic warfare and jamming tended to be supplied to the whole package by long-range fleet assets. So to that extent, the Air Force and the Navy were a little bit different, but both services were actively adapting their tactics to the particular threat and devoting increased assets in theater to it. And they were also devoting increased R&D budgets to finding more effective solutions. I'd say that by early 1966, they had both put the SAM threat at least in enough of a box that it was no longer as debilitating as it had been in the summer, when it was really something that nobody understood and nobody knew how they were going to deal with it. So in order to counter the AAA threat, though, which again was turning out to be much more significant than they had bargained for, both services were moving to higher and higher ingress, but also higher and higher minimum altitudes, meaning the floor that you could not go below even after you dropped your bombs. And effectively, that also meant that there was an attendant loss of accuracy. But both of those things implied. Both services had, by now, also realized that in order to counter the integrated air defense system and to make up for the decreased effectiveness of each bomb dropped, they were going to need to coordinate efforts and plan each day's missions centrally and use concentrated strike or mission packages. In the early days of Rolling Thunder, missions were sort of penny packeted out to subunits, both aboard carriers and at the wings in Thailand. Sometimes the squadron would attack several targets in a given mission, sending just a 4-ship or even a 2-ship sortie to attack each one. As the action picked up, though, they began to realize that targets generally required a much greater effort, not only more aircraft delivering the ordnance on target, but aircraft suppressing flak, aircraft suppressing SAMs, combat air patrol aircraft to intercept any attempt by the Vietnamese People's Air Force to interfere. As a result, the number of targets engaged dropped, and the level of effort expended on each one rose. Whereas Alpha Strike was used in the early days as a Navy term for a kind of once in a long while, all-out effort, pretty soon all strikes essentially became Alpha Strikes. And every day a strike package was put together that involved maybe multiple carriers. So, large mission packages devoted to attacking 1 or 2 major targets in a day really did become a thing for both the Navy and the Air Force. And by 1966, both services had gotten good at planning those kinds of strikes. They were learning what recon information they needed. They were learning where the enemy was in general and how to plan to counter that threat. And they were learning enemy tactics and how to adapt to meet them. They're also getting much better at predicting what they themselves could do and could not do with the weapons and training that they had. Now, the interesting thing here is that knowledge was actually probably fairly durable during Rolling Thunder because it was non-combatants that held that knowledge, and they didn't rotate out with the same frequency that frontline pilots did. So, while the tactical knowledge was perishable, the operational and logistics knowledge was not, and it did definitely improve over time. Unfortunately, while both the Navy and the Air Force were working on ways to distribute the combat load across their large organizations, their opponent was not. While the average U.S. pilot spent a few weeks or months in the combat zone, the average North Vietnamese anti-aircraft gunner or SAM operator or pilot was literally in the combat zone for life, or 10 years, whichever came first. And this is another one of those points which gets overlooked or talked past, I think, in the historical writing. Even by the end of Rolling Thunder, the U.S. was sending pilots, sometimes with just a few missions to their credit, seldom more than 100. The basic North Vietnamese soldier at the time had probably lived through 2 years of attacks, often more than once a day. It's not hard to believe that some NVA veterans had been under air attack more than 1,000 times. This was a significant combat experience mismatch, and it only got worse the longer operations went on as the North Vietnamese kept accreting experience and the U.S. Navy and Air Force kept rotating new and inexperienced airmen into the combat zone. At any rate, Rolling Thunder was to continue, basically the way it was going in 1966, continued for about another 15 months until March of 1968. After that, the nature of the campaign shifted, and it was decided to limit all attacks to an area of the South Vietnam, or close to South Vietnam, south of the 19th parallel anyways, which meant that transportation and transportation infrastructure went back to being the principal target, and then Rolling Thunder was officially brought to an end in November of 1968. Now, as I said in reading the histories of the Vietnam Air War, it's a little hard to piece together how tactics, techniques, and procedures evolved specifically over the course of Rolling Thunder. But I do think it's fair to say that the action had kind of settled into a consistent pattern of measures and countermeasures as each side sought to find a more magic bullet. The Air Force, in particular, really seemed to focus on increasing the use of jamming to interfere with SAM operation. The North Vietnamese responded by prevailing on their Soviet friends to design more jam resistance into their radars, and then the Air Force found better ways of jamming them. Both the Navy and the Air Force certainly refined their approach to the suppression of enemy air defenses as it pertained especially to SAMs. The North Vietnamese responded with their own tactics to defeat, degrade, or deceive the Wild Weasels and the Iron Hands. And this was a back-and-forth struggle as each side looked for a way to surprise the other at a tactical level. Now, the North Vietnamese worked hard at perfecting their use of their integrated air defense system, particularly the rapid collection and analysis of intelligence, even from signals intelligence and patterns. The North Vietnamese became very adept at predicting not only U.S. targeting, but force composition and tactics. They refined their approach to air-to-air combat, as they said. They used very tight GCI control to make maximum use of very limited resources. And they were always simply looking to disrupt whole raids by just appearing at the right moment in the right place, presenting a threat to the bombing force, and then getting out of town as quickly as they could to minimize their own losses. They were not particularly focused on achieving victories over U.S. pilots. They were focused on making U.S. pilots miss their targets, which they did. The North Vietnamese also refined their anti-aircraft targeting system through the use of radar control for high-level targets, and also by perfecting barrage tactics, where they essentially, everybody that was protecting a particular target, knowing the likely direction that the United States aircraft would arrive from, were basically given a piece of the sky to fill with lead, which they did without any actual reference to trying to hit the moving targets. And this, in the end, proved to be quite effective. And again, part of that was based on very good North Vietnamese intelligence about where to expect the U.S. planes and how they would be expected to engage the target. So the United States Air Force and the Navy responded to these shifts by the North Vietnamese by essentially getting out a bigger hammer with which to crack the walnut. They increased the size of MiG-cap patrols. They raised the minimum drop altitudes, increased the number of aircraft required to effectively engage a target. They increased their own use of electronic warfare intelligence to inform and supplement even more active ground control from their side. All in all, though, I think it contributed to a feeling at the front, a feeling of diminishing returns on the U.S. sides, as more and more effort was being applied for a little overall improvement, either in crew survivability or effectiveness. I mean, it's true, crew survivability actually did improve dramatically, mostly in those first 9 months, though. But certainly by the end of 1968, crew survivability, for instance, in the Navy was running at about 1/4 or 4 times as much as survivable as it had been in the early days of Rolling Thunder. So there were definitely lessons that were learned. But it also contributed to an ever-increasing round of recriminations as frontline pilots, military leadership, and civilian leadership lost faith in one another and sought to explain and then publicly assign blame for the fact that they started a war that they could not seem to win. The principal casualty of this blamestorming was Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense through most of Rolling Thunder, who resigned in early 1968. History has decided that he was an appropriate scapegoat for the not unreasonable reason that he was, in fact, an arrogant jerk. But unfortunately, by the end of the conflict, he maybe was the most, provided the most prophetic conclusion about the whole exercise when he said, "Enemy operations in the South cannot, on the basis of any reports I have seen, be stopped by air bombardment, short, that is, of the virtual annihilation of North Vietnam and its people," unquote, which is probably about as close to the truth of statement as I've heard about Operation Rolling Thunder. Now, I would actually say that the scapegoating of Robert McNamara has probably actually, at the time and even later on, probably interfered significantly with efforts to learn from the experience of Rolling Thunder. I mean, having been handed a convenient fall guy, everyone else from frontline pilots to planners to military leadership other actors in the administration settled into a pattern of not confronting the real reasons for their failure and instead blaming it on the departed Bob. But, there was, in fact, after all, a lot to learn about how, and in fact, why, to conduct a modern air war. And some of those lessons were not assimilated by the end of Rolling Thunder by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, probably the most important ones got missed. But that's not to say they all did. And so let's take a look at that topic in the next episode. Let's talk about the conversations that happened after Rolling Thunder and how both the Air Force and the Navy decided what changes they decided they needed to make if they were going to win the next round. So, thanks for listening today to the History of Iron Bombing podcast. And this is Sidekick, and we will talk to you soon.